Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be tackling feminist philosophy, but more specifically where pragmatist and continental feminist thought sort of come together. Now that might sound like a mouthful, but I promise you it's a really fascinating area that can help us see gender dynamics and power structures in a whole new light.
I think what makes this intersection so interesting is that both pragmatism and continental philosophy question those rigid categories and binaries that often contribute to gender inequality.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. We know that pragmatism is all about kind of real-world impact, less about abstract theories and more about how our ideas actually translate into actions. And we're talking about philosophers like William James and John Dewey, who are all about connecting thought and action.
Right, and continental philosophy often challenges those grand narratives, those big picture explanations that can sometimes miss the nuances of individual experiences and historical context. We're talking about figures like Simone de Beauvoir, Michel Foucault, and Judith Butler, who question those seemingly universal truths and expose the power dynamics at play.
So where pragmatism is kind of grounded and action-oriented, continental philosophy is more about deconstructing those accepted truths and power structures.
Exactly. And when these two schools of thought meet in feminist philosophy, it gets really interesting because both of them are suspicious of fixed categories and universal truth, and both see knowledge as something that is rooted in our experience, our bodies, and the world around us, and that it's constantly evolving.
So they both challenge those kind of rigid, fixed ways of thinking that can limit, our understanding of gender and power. Okay, I'm ready for some specific examples. Where do we start?
Let's start with Susan Bordeaux's analysis of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. He was obsessed with finding absolute certainty in a world that felt increasingly uncertain.
Ah, Descartes,
Yeah.
the OG rationalist. How does this connect to feminist thought?
Well, in her book, The Flight to Objectivity, she argues that this quest for pure objective knowledge ended up rejecting anything seen as messy or emotional qualities that are often associated with the feminine.
So this pursuit of pure reason, this flight from the feminine, ended up actually reinforcing this hierarchy that privileged the masculine over the feminine.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that she connects this back to the anxieties of Descartes' time, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, all these huge upheavals that were shaking the foundations of society. And it's like, the more threatened a culture feels, the more it clings to those traditional gender roles and hierarchies.
So Descartes was kind of a product of his time, and his philosophical ideas, while seemingly abstract, were actually shaped by those anxieties and power dynamics at play.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Bordeaux sees this same pattern playing out in our own contemporary world.
Oh, okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah.
So the flight from the feminine is not just some historical artifact. It's still very much alive today.
Absolutely. Think about the anxieties that we have now around things like climate change and economic instability and political polarization. These anxieties often lead to a backlash against anything that is perceived as feminine or weak. There's this push for, strong, decisive, often authoritarian leadership, a return to traditional values, a rejection of anything that challenges those norms.
It's like almost by rejecting the feminine, we're trying to reassert control in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and out of control. We're seeking that same kind of certainty that Descartes was searching for, that sense of order and stability.
Exactly. And this is why Bordeaux's analysis is so important. It helps us to see how seemingly neutral ideas, even philosophical ones, can be used to reinforce those existing power structures.
So we need to be more aware of the ways in which our pursuit of knowledge, even our very ways of thinking, can be shaped by these underlying cultural anxieties and power dynamics.
Precisely. And that awareness allows us to challenge those assumptions, to create space for different ways of knowing and being, ways that don't rely on those rigid binary oppositions between masculine and feminine.
Okay, so we've seen how our pursuit of knowledge can be shaped by these hidden power dynamics. But what about our understanding of the physical world? How does that play into all of this?
That's a great question, and it leads us to the work of Elizabeth Gross. In her book, Architecture from the Outside, she challenges the traditional view of space as just this, this empty container.
So not just a stage where everything happens, but something more dynamic.
Right. Gross argues that space is actually dynamic and evolving, constantly in flux, and she draws on both pragmatist and continental thinkers to make this point.
This reminds me of how Heraclitus said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." It's always changing, just like,
Yeah.
we are. So how does this dynamic view of space connect to feminist thought?
Well, by seeing space as fluid and interconnected, we can start to dismantle those rigid boundaries that have often confined women to certain roles and spaces.
Hmm.
Think about the classic public-private divide, for example. Women have historically been relegated to the private domestic sphere, while men have dominated the public sphere of politics and work.
That public-private divide, it's like this invisible wall that keeps women in their place. So Gross is saying that if we challenge this fixed notion of space, we can start to break down those barriers.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that she uses architecture, this very concrete and physical discipline, to explore these, complex philosophical concepts.
Well, that's a cool approach. So she's literally showing us how the spaces we inhabit shape our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world.
Precisely. And by drawing on the ideas of thinkers like Darwin and Nietzsche, William James and Henri Bergson, and even Gilles Deleuze, she shows how this understanding of space as dynamic and evolving is not just, some abstract philosophical concept, but it's a reflection of the very nature of reality itself.
Okay, so we've talked about the flight from the feminine. We've talked about the dynamic nature of space. What other, areas of feminist thought kind of intersect with pragmatism and continental philosophy?
Well, Donna Haraway takes this exploration even further. She focuses on the often hidden power dynamics within technology and science.
Technology and science, those are areas that are often seen as, objective and neutral. But Haraway is saying there's more to the story.
In her book, Modest Witness at Second Millennium, Female Men Meet Mouse, Feminism and Technoscience, Haraway critiques what she calls the fetishistic tendencies of technoscience. She argues that we often focus on the technology itself without considering the complex social and political processes that went into its creation.
So we're blinded by the shiny new gadget, and we forget about all the people and the systems that lie behind it.
Exactly. She uses the computer chip as an example. We see this neutral piece of technology. But Haraway reminds us that it's a product of, war and labor exploitation, even the appropriation of women's bodies. It's about understanding technology not as something separate from us, but as something deeply intertwined with our social and political realities.
That's a powerful image, the computer chip as a symbol of those hidden power dynamics.
And Haraway doesn't just point out the problem, she also offers a way forward. She suggests that we need to be more critical of the stories that we tell about technology, to see it not as a neutral force, but as a tool that can be used for both good and bad.
So it's not about rejecting technology altogether, but about being more conscious of its impact and using it to create a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond that fetishistic relationship with technology and seeing it as something we can shape and control rather than something that controls us.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these ideas connect.
Yeah.
We've gone from, Descartes' quest for certainty to the dynamic nature of space to the hidden power dynamics of technology. It's like we're peeling back the layers of reality and seeing the world in a whole new light.
And that's just the beginning. We've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating intersection of pragmatist and continental feminist thought. There's so much more to explore.
I'm definitely hooked. I can't wait to dive deeper into these ideas and see where they lead us.
I think you'll find it's a journey well worth taking.
Welcome back to our deep dive into feminist philosophy. Last time we were talking about how these seemingly neutral concepts like knowledge, space, and even technology can be intertwined with power dynamics and gender inequality. I'm eager to see where we go from here.
Well, now that we've kind of laid some groundwork, I think it's time to get even more granular and explore how these ideas translate into our understanding of bodies and embodiment. It's amazing how often philosophical discussions seem to forget about the body altogether, as if our minds exist in some abstract realm separate from our physical selves.
It's like we're trying to transcend our physicality, to become these pure minds, which, as we saw with Descartes, can have some unintended consequences. So how do pragmatist and continental feminists bring the body back into the equation?
Well, Shannon Sullivan, for example, offers a really compelling perspective in her book, Living Across and Through Skins. She argues for a concept of the body as transactional, meaning that our bodies are not just these fixed biological entities, but are constantly shaped by our interactions with the world around us.
So our bodies aren't just static objects. They're constantly changing and being shaped by our experiences.
Exactly. Think about it. The food we eat, the air we breathe, the social environments we inhabit, all these things contribute to who we are, both physically and mentally. It's not just nature versus nurture, it's this constant interplay between the two.
So it's like our bodies are these archives of our experiences. They're recording every interaction, every encounter. So how does this transactional view of the body challenge traditional ways of thinking about gender?
Well, for one thing, it challenges those mind-body dualisms that have been used to justify the subordination of women. That old stereotype of women as more emotional and men as more rational. This is often based on a view of the body as separate from and inferior to the mind.
So by emphasizing this interconnectedness of mind-body, Sullivan is saying that we can't separate our physical experiences from our mental and emotional lives. It's all part of one whole, right?
Precisely. And she goes even further, exploring how different bodies are affected by these transactional processes. She points out that some bodies are privileged, while others are marginalized or even violated based on factors like race, gender, and sexuality. It's a powerful analysis that connects the personal experience of embodiment to broader systems of power.
So it's not just about recognizing the body, but about understanding the different ways in which bodies are experienced and valued in our society. Some bodies are given more space, more freedom, more opportunities, while others are confined, controlled, even exploited.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important aspect of embodiment, which is pleasure. Liddell McWhorter, in her book Bodies and Pleasures, challenges the way in which certain forms of pleasure have been normalized, while others have been marginalized or even pathologized.
Okay, so we're not just talking about physical sensations here, but about how our experiences of pleasure are shaped by social norms and power dynamics.
Exactly. McWhorter argues that the way we experience and understand pleasure is deeply intertwined with those systems of power that shape our society. She's particularly interested in how these systems impact women and LGBTQ plus individuals, whose bodies and pleasures have often been subject to control and regulation.
So it's not just about individual preferences or choices, but about understanding how those preferences are shaped by those broader cultural norms and power dynamics. It's like there's this whole hidden script that tells us what kinds of pleasures are acceptable and which ones are not.
Right. And McWhorter challenges us to be more critical of those norms, to question why certain forms of pleasure are deemed acceptable, while others are deemed deviant or even dangerous. She's asking, who gets to define pleasure, and who benefits from those definitions?
So it's about reclaiming those bodies and pleasures that have been marginalized or silenced. It's about asserting our right to experience pleasure on our own terms, without shame or judgment. But how do we actually do that? How do we challenge those deeply ingrained norms and power structures?
Well, this is where the idea of embodiment as a site of resistance comes in. Cressida J. Hayes, in her book Self-Transformations, explores this idea, drawing on the work of both Foucault and the pragmatist Richard Schusterman.
Now, I've heard of Schusterman. He's known for his work on somesthetics, the study of the body, as a site of both experience and knowledge. So how does Hayes bring these ideas together?
Well, she argues that by consciously engaging with our bodies through practices like yoga or dance or martial arts, we can actually challenge those normalized ways of being that have been imposed upon us. It's about using our bodies to create new possibilities, new ways of experiencing and understanding the world.
It's like we're taking back control of our bodies, reclaiming them as sites of power and agency, rather than objects of control and discipline.
Exactly. And Hayes suggests that these practices of self-transformation can have a ripple effect, leading to broader social and political change. It's a really optimistic and empowering perspective that sees the body as a site of both personal and collective liberation.
This reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the idea of habit change. If we can transform those ingrained habits of thought and behavior at the individual level, perhaps we can also transform the social structures that perpetuate oppression.
That's a key insight. And it's one that many pragmatists and continental feminists are exploring. It's about recognizing that social change starts with individual transformation, but it doesn't end there. We need to work on both levels simultaneously, challenging those oppressive structures while also cultivating new ways of being in the world.
So it's not an either proposition, but a both-hand approach. We need to be both critical and creative, both analytical and embodied in our pursuit of a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. And this brings us to another really important concept that bridges pragmatist and continental feminist thought, the idea of the other.
This is a term that gets thrown around a lot, often with very different meanings.
Yeah.
How are pragmatist and continental feminists approaching this concept?
Well, it's definitely a complex and contested term, and there's no single unified perspective on it. But one thing that many feminist thinkers share is a critique of the way in which the other has been used to define and marginalize certain groups. Think about how women have been defined as other to men, how people of color have been defined as other to white people, how LGBTQ plus individuals have been defined as other to heterosexual people.
It's about creating a hierarchy,
Right.
a system of in-groups and out-groups, where those in power define themselves as the norm and everyone else as the deviation.
Exactly. And this process of othering is often based on essentialist assumptions, the idea that certain groups are inherently different or inferior based on their biology, their culture, or some other fixed characteristic.
So it's a way of justifying inequality by claiming that those differences are natural or inevitable. So how do we challenge this tendency to other? How do we move beyond those essentialist categories and recognize the shared humanity of all people?
Well, pragmatist feminists in particular emphasize the importance of dialogue and understanding. They argue that we need to move beyond those essentialist categories and recognize the shared humanity of all people. It's about seeing difference not as a threat, but as a source of enrichment and growth.
So instead of seeing the other as something to be feared or excluded, we need to see it as an opportunity to learn, grow, and expand our understanding of the world.
Exactly. And this requires a willingness to listen to and learn from those who are different from us. It's about recognizing that our own perspectives are limited and that we can always benefit from engaging with other viewpoints.
And this connects back to the idea of epistemic humility, right? Recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that our knowledge is always incomplete. We need to be open to being challenged, to having our assumptions questioned, and to learning from those who have different experiences and perspectives.
Right. And it's also about recognizing that knowledge is not neutral, that it's always situated within a particular context and shaped by particular interests and values. This is something that both pragmatists and continental feminists emphasize.
So it's not just about acquiring more knowledge, but about being more critical of the knowledge we have, questioning its assumptions, and being open to alternative ways of knowing. We need to ask, whose voices are being heard, whose perspectives are being privileged, and whose are being silenced.
Precisely. And this brings us to another important aspect of the other, the question of how we imagine the future. Both pragmatist and continental feminist traditions are concerned with creating a more just and equitable future, a future that values difference and recognizes the interconnectedness of all beings.
So it's not about assimilating the other into the existing order, but about creating a new order that is more inclusive and just. It's about radically transforming our relationships, our institutions, and even ourselves to create a world where everyone can flourish.
You got it. It's a challenging project, but it's one that these thinkers believe is essential for creating a truly just and equitable world.
Welcome back to the deep dive. In parts 1 and 2, we really went deep into how pragmatist and continental feminist thought come together to challenge those kind of default settings of philosophy. We questioned everything from how we view knowledge and space to even how we understand our own bodies and experiences. Now, in this final part, I'm excited to see how these really powerful ideas are actually put into action in the real world. It's one thing to talk about theory, but how do these concepts actually translate into real-world change?
You're right. Action is key, and I think one of the most exciting areas where we see this happening is in the expansion of the philosophical canon itself. For a long time, the canon, that collection of essential texts and thinkers, has been pretty exclusive, dominated by, white European male voices. But feminist scholars are working to change that.
It's like those default settings we talked about earlier,
Sure.
right? Those assumptions about, who gets to be a philosopher, whose ideas are worthy of study.
Exactly, but scholars like Cynthia Willett are pushing back against those limitations, bringing in perspectives from marginalized groups and showing how those perspectives can actually enrich and deepen our understanding of philosophy itself. In her book, The Soul of Justice, Social Bonds and Racial Hubris, she does something really interesting. She brings together thinkers like G.W.F. Hegel and Luce Irigaray, these heavy hitters in European philosophy. And she places them in dialogue with African-American thinkers like Toni Morrison and Patricia Hill Collins.
Wow, that's quite a mix. I'm imagining those dinner party conversations. But seriously, what happens when we bring these different traditions into conversation with each other? What new insights emerge?
Well, one of the key insights is that traditional philosophical accounts of freedom, they often rely on this notion of separation, this idea that we become individuals by separating ourselves from others, by becoming independent and self-sufficient. But Willett challenges this notion. She draws on the experiences of enslaved people, showing how the forced separation of families and communities led to this really profound sense of social death.
That's a really powerful point. It's like saying that true freedom can't exist in isolation. It's bound up with our connections to others, with our sense of belonging and interdependence.
Precisely. And this recognition of the importance of social bonds, it connects beautifully with Patricia Hill Collins' work on intersectionality, which we touched on earlier. She argues that pragmatism, with its focus on lived experience and social context, can offer valuable insights into how we build coalitions and create social change across different axes of oppression.
Okay, remind me again, what does intersectionality mean?
So intersectionality is all about understanding how different forms of oppression like racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia all intersect and reinforce each other. It's recognizing that these systems of oppression don't exist in isolation. They work together to create these really complex and overlapping forms of disadvantage.
So it's not just about adding up different forms of oppression, but about understanding how they interact and create unique challenges for those who experience them.
Exactly. And Collins argues that pragmatism with this, focus on lived experience and the importance of social context can help us to understand those intersections and to develop effective strategies for challenging those systems of power. It's not just about recognizing those intersections, but about finding ways to work together to build solidarity across those differences and to create social change that benefits everyone.
It's like saying, okay, we see how these systems of oppression are interconnected. Now, how do we work together to dismantle them? It's about moving beyond theory into action, which is really what pragmatism is all about.
Exactly. And this focus on action, on changing those default settings of power and exclusion, is also evident in the work of Christy Dotson. In her essay, How is this paper philosophy? She takes a critical look at the culture of professional philosophy, particularly its historical exclusion of women of color and other marginalized groups.
You know, this is an issue that's been getting a lot of attention lately, and it's great to see how pragmatist and continental feminist thought is being brought to bear on this problem. So what's Dodson's critique?
Well, she argues that the traditional emphasis on justification and legitimation within philosophy often relies on norms and assumptions that are not shared by all practitioners. Those unspoken rules of the game, the criteria for what counts as good philosophy, are often biased towards certain perspectives and experiences.
So it's like those default settings are operating even within the discipline of philosophy itself, determining who gets to speak, who gets taken seriously, whose ideas are considered legitimate.
Exactly. And those default settings can create this sense of alienation and exclusion for those who don't fit the mold. Doxon calls for a more inclusive culture of praxis within philosophy, one that values diverse perspectives, multiple canons, and a wider range of approaches to knowledge production.
It's not about lowering standards, but about expanding our understanding of what philosophy can be and who gets to participate in the conversation. It's about recognizing that knowledge is produced in many different ways, and that those different ways of knowing can enrich and deepen our understanding of the world. But how do we actually create that more inclusive culture? How do we challenge those ingrained habits of thought and behavior that maintain those systems of exclusion?
That's the big question, and it's one that Jose Medina addresses head-on in his book, The Epistemology of Resistance: Gender and Racial Oppression, Epistemic Injustice, and Resistant Imaginations. He dives deep into how oppression can create epistemic insensitivities, those, blind spots, if you will, that prevent us from seeing and understanding the experiences of others.
So it's not enough to just acknowledge that oppression exists. We need to actively work to dismantle those mental barriers that prevent us from truly understanding and empathizing with each other's experiences.
Precisely. Medina, drawing on both continental and pragmatist thought, offers us some concrete strategies for cultivating what he calls a resistant imagination. And this resistant imagination allows us to challenge those dominant narratives, to question those default settings, and to see the world through the eyes of those who have been marginalized.
It's like developing a new set of lenses, a new way of seeing the world that allows us to recognize and challenge those systems of power that perpetuate oppression and inequality.
Exactly. And it involves developing empathy and compassion and a willingness to question our own assumptions. It means actively seeking out those perspectives that challenge our own, even when it's uncomfortable or disorienting.
It's about recognizing that true understanding requires us to step outside our own comfort zones and engage with the world in all of its complexity and diversity. And it's about taking action, using that understanding to create a more just and equitable world.
And that's the beauty of this intersection of pragmatist and continental feminist thought. It's not just about abstract theorizing, it's about using those ideas to create real-world change. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our individual actions have an impact, and that we have the power to create a better future together.
Wow, this has been an incredible journey. We've explored some really complex ideas, we've challenged traditional ways of thinking, and we've seen how those ideas can translate into real-world action. I feel like I've not only learned a lot, but also I've been challenged and inspired to think differently about the world and my place in it.
Well, it's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. Remember, creating a more just and equitable world is an ongoing process. It requires us to be engaged, to be critical, to be compassionate, and to never stop questioning those default settings that limit our understanding of ourselves and each other.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into feminist philosophy. We hope it sparked your curiosity and given you some new tools for navigating the complexities of our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.